Welcome back to the drawing board with me, Steven Lloyd, and today we will be talking about progressive collapse or disproportionate failure. There's lots of ways this can happen, but there's a few simple models that I like to use as the examples. First is the house of cards, and that is if you take out any one of these elements, the entire structure will collapse because there's no redundancy in the system. Every single element is required to operate at every point in order for this structure to stand up. And the loss of any single one will mean that there is no safe load path from the top to the bottom and the entire thing will go. The way we fix this is making sure that there is redundancy, either redundant elements that can take over if something fails, or more commonly, making sure that there is redundant strength left in each element. So for example, if we eliminated this column at the bottom of this structure, each of the columns to the side would be strong enough to take the load and the beam would be strong enough to ensure that this didn't collapse straight down. Redundancy in the system means that by taking out one or more elements, you still have enough strength left over to make sure the job is safe. The next version is a domino rally, or the domino effect. What happens is you have a failure potentially of one element, the load that was supposed to go on that element passes to the next one, which then collapses, that passes to the next one, which then collapses, so on and so forth. Very similar to the house of cards, but it's usually on more simple structures where you have continuous linear elements repeated one after the other. If you do domestic dwelling design, you'll find there are some structural codes there that ask you to put discontinuities in systems like this, such that if you did get a collapse of a column and that beam then collapses with it, it doesn't pass that load on to the rest of the system and you get a small local failure rather than a failure of the entire system. Now we're in the business of temporary shoring equipment, propping and big whalers. And what usually happens with these systems is some combination between the house of cards and the domino, where if you got potentially a loss of prop, you would want to know that each of the props either side could support that load and the beam would be able to support it, just like the redundancy in the house of cards scenario. But you also want to make sure that there is no instability caused by that, for instance with joints that shouldn't be there, that will cause the next prop and the next prop and the next prop to fall out of place. So here's where we come on to design for loss of prop. And usually we design either for redundant systems where each prop can take load. The problem here you will always get, because whalers are, by comparison to the stiff props operating axially, the whalers are quite flexible and the wall might be quite flexible. So even though you are ensuring that there is no structural failure that continues, you still have to be wary that even when designing for loss of prop and preventing progressive collapse, you will still have some small service failure in that area. There will be some potentially deflections that are larger than what you wanted. That's really simple to do when it's a continuous simple system, where it's lots of similar elements, one after the other after the other. What's not quite so easy to do is where you get a large open area with a complex arrangement of propping. You can't really design the props adjacent to take the load of the prop in the middle. For instance, these little knee braces in the corner, they're operating a different way. They're doing a different job to this long prop here. They're supporting a different area of wall. The way we normally get over this is by designing for robustness, so that rather than having redundancy by using the strength of different elements, having redundancy within the element itself, so that you can apply more load to it or a load from a different direction. The usual example is a strike from an excavator, and making sure that this prop will still withstand that, at least in some shape, and allow you the time to either replace the prop or to make good any damage that's been done without any failure occurring. But is local failure acceptable? The Eurocodes tell you that you have to prevent progressive collapse. You have to make sure that any collapse isn't disproportionate to the cause of the failure. The example that's often used that changed the law in this country was a gas explosion in a high-rise building, where not only the walls and the columns supporting the area around it collapsed, but walls 2, 3, 4 bays further down and several floors above and below also collapsed. But were a gas explosion to occur and the area around it fail but nothing else, is it acceptable in the context of a shoring excavation to have a local failure? In the middle of the field, you can quite happily accept you'll have some movements of the wall, nobody will worry too much, they could backfill partially, try and make things right. I think I would struggle to get that past somebody operating in central London, because what happens when you get small local failures like that, even if they're caused by accident, small local failures like that will often lead to failures of other assets that are behind the wall. And so this is where we get in a bit of a dilemma. Do we end up designing for so much robustness that there can never be an accidental failure, in which case you're effectively doubling the amount of equipment you're using in an excavation? Or is it acceptable to take a risk-based approach that if there was an accidental failure of a single prop, that you can somehow accept or absorb some unwanted movement? It's not a decision for me to make here. It'll be based on a case-by-case basis. But hopefully this has given you some insight into how we look at progressive failure, and especially how we think about loss of prop condition. I think it's probably worth revisiting loss of prop in a little bit more detail in another Back to the Drawing Board. But until then, I hope you do come back to the drawing board, and I'll see you soon.